Welcome. You're here now, and all you need to do is settle in. Let the day drift away like mist over a quiet moor. In this moment, there's no rush, no noise, just the steady rhythm of history gently unfolding like the pages of an old, forgotten journal. Tonight, we return to a time of coal smoke and cobblestone, horse-drawn carts, and gaslit streets, the Victorian era, often remembered for its stern moral codes, industrial innovation, and tightly buttoned waistcoats. The era was also marked by deep inequalities and quiet, persistent struggles for survival. Beneath the polished surface of drawing rooms and tea parties, ordinary people, were simply trying to eat, to nourish themselves, to make it through another day. What did they eat? How did they feed their families when wages were low and food was dear? What was life like in the kitchens, cellars, and street markets of Victorian Britain? Tonight, we explore the overlooked story of food in this age of contrast, and not the feasts of the elite, but the meals of miners, factory workers, chimney sweeps, and laundresses. The scraps, stews, and solutions they relied on. You'll walk through damp alleys and bustling markets, enter narrow homes warmed by little more than a flickering fire, and sit quietly beside worn wooden tables where survival was measured out in pence and potatoes. Let's begin. Imagine a narrow terraced house in an industrial town. The year is 1856. The street outside is slick with rain and soot. Chimneys puff their dark breath into the grey sky, and the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels echoes on the cobbles. You step inside through a stiff, swollen door. The warmth of a hearth greets you, though it's faint, almost reluctant. In this small room, the kitchen, the dining area, the gathering place life revolves around a single fire. The kitchen is humble. Perhaps it is more accurate to call it a hearth room. A soot-streaked grate is fitted with a blackened kettle, and above it hangs a shelf of mismatched crockery, some chipped, others borrowed. A bucket of coal sits nearby, expensive, so it's used sparingly, and beside it, a pile of potato peelings awaiting tomorrow's broth. This is not a place of cookbooks and fresh herbs, but of frugality and improvisation. The family may have only one pot, and it serves every purpose. In it, soups and stews simmer slowly, usually made from whatever is available that day. Perhaps a bone begged from the butcher, or a heel of bread thickened with water and bits of cabbage. These are meals born of necessity, not flavour. Breakfast, if it is taken at all, is simple and silent. Bread, often stale, softened with water or milk if there is any. A spread of dripping the congealed fat from yesterday's cooking adds a hint of substance. Sometimes cold porridge, made in large quantities the night before, is eaten the next morning. It's thick, lumpy, and grey, but it fills the stomach. Children hurry off to work with empty bellies or a crust in their pocket. The adults follow, trudging to factories or workhouses. Meals must stretch. Dinner is the main event, though it may occur well after dark. A thin soup, often called skilly, is made of potatoes, onions, or turnips. Occasionally, if luck allows, a slice of bacon is included, boiled until its flavour has all but vanished into the broth. The leftover water may be saved for the next day. Nothing is wasted. The food is bland, but it is steady. The rhythm of boiling, soaking, and scraping forms the soundtrack to survival. If there is anything green, it is often boiled into submission, transforming cabbage and kale into mush that can be swallowed easily, even without teeth. Salt, when affordable, is precious. Pepper, rare. Meals taste of what they are. Earth, grain, and time. A prized possession in many homes is a dripping tina little container, kept near the hearth where fat is stored between meals. Lard, suet, and grease become invaluable, added to bread or pastries when the household can afford flour. Sundays offer a whisper of luxury. For those who can scrape together a few pennies, a joint of meat may be bought more bone than flesh, but roasted proudly. The roast is eaten hot the first day, and any scraps are reused in hash, pie, or soup for days afterward. The bones are boiled for stock, and the fat rendered down. Every part is used. Baking is rare among the poorest, as coal and ovens are both expensive luxuries. Instead, flatbreads and boiled puddings are more common, steamed in cloth, filled with cheap ingredients like suet and dried peas. They are dense and filling. Street vendors occasionally provide a diversion. Pies sold hot, sometimes with dubious fillings, or bowls of peas pudding, mushy and salty, eaten standing in the street. The kitchen, if you could call it that, is a space of endless creativity bounded by poverty. It smells faintly of onions and smoke, of damp cloth and scorched iron. There is a rhythm here, built not of ease, but of endurance. A wooden spoon stirs the pot slowly, over and over, in a circle as unchanging as the days themselves. This is what survival tastes like in the lower reaches of Victorian Britain. Not bitter, not sweet, just plain, persistent, and quietly dignified. As we step away from the home kitchen and into the broader landscape of Victorian food and survival, we find ourselves in an unexpected place beneath the whitewashed ceilings of a military hospital, thousands of miles from England. It is 1854, and the Crimean War is underway. Amid the wounded, the weary, and the dying, walks a woman whose legacy will forever alter the relationship between nourishment and recovery. Florence Nightingale. Florence, known to many by the soft glow of her lamp, became a towering figure not just in nursing, but in public health. Her work during the Crimean campaign drew attention to a quiet killer, more persistent than bullets or bayonets. Malnutrition. When Florence first arrived at the Scutari Barrack Hospital in Turkey, what she found was not merely chaos but hunger. The soldiers lay on filthy straw, often without blankets, and meals, when served, were abysmal. Bread infested with weevils, soup that was thin, greasy, and served cold, rations that were insufficient and sporadically distributed. Many soldiers died, not of their wounds, but of starvation and infection, compounded by poor food. She set to work immediately, organizing kitchens, securing supplies, and insisting on something then considered revolutionary, that patients be fed properly, not just calories, but care-warm food, consistent meals, and nutritional value. She introduced rice puddings and beef tea, essentially a long-simmered broth intended to restore strength. This beef tea, although bland, became a symbol of her effort. It was easy to digest and rich in nutrients extracted through long boiling. She also emphasized cleanliness in the kitchen and proper storage, recognizing that foodborne illness could spread just as easily as infection through wounds. Florence also kept meticulous records. She charted the dietary needs of soldiers, the outcomes of different rations, and the impact of nutrition on recovery. These observations laid the groundwork for dietary science in hospitals. In many ways, she treated the kitchen as a second Wardone, where quiet healing began with hot meals, offered with dignity. Back in Britain, her influence trickled through civilian institutions. Poorhouses and hospitals began to take food more seriously, not as an indulgence, but as a crucial component of care. Special diets were developed for the sick, the elderly, and the labouring poor. Gruels, custards, and boiled meats entered medical menus, alongside barley water and weak tea. Still, these diets were far from appetizing by modern standards. Gruel, for example, was often made from oats or barley, boiled in water or milk until soft, with little to no flavoring. Yet for those suffering from fever, injury, or exhaustion, it offered warmth, hydration, and calories in an age before modern nutrition science. Florence Nightingale's work underscores a truth that threads through all of history. Food is medicine. In times of scarcity, simplicity becomes strategy. And even in war, where chaos reigns, the act of feeding others thoughtfully, consistently can become an anchor of survival. Back in Victorian cities, her reforms echoed into institutions like workhouses and almshouses, where the poorest found themselves at the mercy of public charity. The workhouse diet was notoriously meagre: bread, gruel, a little cheese, perhaps potatoes or broth on occasion. Yet even there, the pressure to provide more consistent, cleaner food began to grow. Slowly, the idea that the poor deserved more than just sustenance took root, an idea Florence had helped plant with every ladle of broth and every line in her ledgers. Through her, we glimpse not just a biography, but a movement, the beginning of thinking about food not only as fuel, but as care, quiet, unspoken, and vital. Now let us step outside, into the early morning mist of a Victorian city, London perhaps, or Manchester. The day is just beginning, the sky pale and uncertain. The streets are still quiet, but already the scent of food rises faintly from alleyways and corners. For those who could not afford kitchens or time, food was often bought on the street. Victorian street food was not glamorous. It was practical, cheap, and aimed squarely at the working poor. It sustained the dock worker, the errand boy, the laundress. It was a meal, eaten standing, or as one walked to the mill, or crouched on a curb in the chill of dawn. Vendors called out their wares in sing-song cries. They carried trays, pushed carts, or laid out simple stalls beside the gutters. The offerings varied, but were always humble. A common option was the hot potato. These were sold from barrels or baskets, baked until soft and steaming. One could buy a single potato and eat it with salt, perhaps a little butter if the vendor had any. They were filling, warm, and simple. Another staple was pea soup, ladled into chipped mugs or shallow bowls. Sometimes it was thickened with flour, sometimes thin as broth. Vendors might add a few pieces of bread, or a pinch of herbs to lend flavour. People would drink it slowly, hands cupped around the vessel for warmth more than taste. Fried fish, too, began to appear in this aeronaut, yet accompanied by chips, but often sold wrapped in paper and eaten quickly. The fish was usually herring or sprats, cheap and abundant. Deep fried in lard, it offered a rare indulgence. Crispness, salt, the illusion of richness. The smell alone, greasy and marine, would gather small crowds. And then there were pies, ubiquitous, mysterious pies. Often, no one could say exactly what they contained. Some were filled with ortolans, liver, tripe, others with eels or leftover meat, still others with mashed vegetables or seasoned suet. A pie cost a penny or two, and it came hot, encased in flaky crust or, more often, in soggy pastry cooked hastily in reused grease. One of the more curious dishes was sheep's trotters. These were boiled and sold on the street, sometimes split and seasoned with vinegar. They were gelatinous, chewy, and nourishing in the way that slow-cooked collagen-rich foods tend to be. Eaten by hand, they were popular among labourers who needed filling fare at a low cost. Pickled goods were also common. Sellers offered onions, eggs, and gherkins floating in cloudy jars of brine. These acidic snacks were sharp and preserved well. Some swore by pickled walnuts, dark and earthy, while others reached for slices of pickled beetroot, blood-red and sweet. Perhaps most symbolic of the Victorian street food experience was the humble whelk. These sea snails, boiled and served cold, were eaten with toothpicks from wooden carts. Their briny tang, chewy texture, and faintly fishy odour divided opinion, but they were cheap, filling, and considered a delicacy of sorts by many who rarely saw the sea. What unites all these offerings is not just their thrift, but their ingenuity. They reflect a culture that made do with what was available. Nothing was wasted. The scraps of butcher shops, the runoff from bakeries, the gleanings of the seal were transformed into something portable, edible, and surprisingly complex. There is also a quiet rhythm to the street food day. Morning saw porridge and tea, midday brought pies and soup, evenings offered roasted chestnuts, sold from glowing braziers. The smell of them filled the air in winter smoky, sweet, comforting. In some neighbourhoods, old women sold penny sweets to children, or oranges sliced and sugared for a rare burst of brightness. These foods, though modest, stitched together the daily lives of millions. They were eaten with mittened hands and grimy fingers, on doorsteps and under gas lamps. Their recipes were rarely written down, passed instead from vendor to apprentice, from mother to daughter. Little remains of them today. No grand cookbooks, no preserved stalls, but archaeology has begun to uncover hints. Oyster shells in city gutters, scorched fish bones in alley corners, fragments of ceramic mugs bearing the stains of soup and stew. The street food of Victorian England reminds us that culture is not only built in palaces or parlours, but on street corners, amid steam and soot and the endless desire to be fed quickly, cheaply, and well enough to see another day through. Now we turn from the streets and alleyways to the drawing rooms and dining halls of the Victorian elitier world, apart, yet coexisting in the same cities, just behind heavier doors and thicker curtains. Imagine a grand townhouse in Belgravia, or a country estate nestled in the rolling countryside of Yorkshire. The air here smells not of coal smoke and stewed cabbage, but of beeswax polish, tea leaves, and roast meats. Kitchens are not a single blackened pot over a weak fire, but cavernous spaces humming with clatter and command. Dozens of servants bustle about under the direction of a head cook. Copper pans gleam on the walls. Game hangs in the larder. Flour is sifted. Custards are stirred. Sauces are simmered. For the wealthy, food was not only sustenance, it was display, ritual, and theatre. Meals could span multiple courses and hours, especially dinners. A typical upper-class breakfast might include eggs, cold meats, kippers, toast, and marmalade, with strong tea served from a gleaming silver pot. This was enjoyed not in haste, but in a sunlit breakfast room, with starched linens and the morning papers. Luncheon sat, least for the ladies of the household, were lighter affairs: chicken croquettes, jellied aspic, fresh bread, fruit preserves. For the men, particularly in town, lunch might be taken at a club or gentleman's establishment, perhaps involving roast beef, kidney pie, or game birds, washed down with ale or wine. But it was dinner that defined the Victorian elite. Formal dinners began around 7 or 8 in the evening and often unfolded in 7, 9, or even 13 courses. The table was meticulously laid: bone-handled knives, silver cutlery, crystal glasses, and fine porcelain plates bearing monograms or floral motifs. The courses began with soup, perhaps a clear consommé or thick turtle soup, followed by fish such as sole in cream sauce. Then came the entrees: roast venison, beef tongue with caper sauce, or mutton with red currant jelly. Poultry followed, often pheasant or capon, stuffed and larded. Side dishes included vegetables soaked in butter, moulded potato purees, and artfully arranged salads dressed with oil and vinegar. Interspersed among these were delicacy sweetbreads, truffles, and game pâté, alongside endless sauces: bechamel, velouté, or rich gravies, each presented in silver boats by footmen in white gloves. Desserts were no less elaborate: jellies shaped like castles, plum puddings flamed in brandy, tarts filled with apricot or raspberry, blancmange, syllabub, and charlotte russe. All this was washed down with wine, from light sherries and hocks early in the meal, to robust clarets and ports near the end. It was not unusual for an entire animal to be served whole boar's head, swan, or peacock, though these were mostly ceremonial by the later Victorian years. The presentation mattered just as much as the flavour. Yet, despite this lavishness, even upper-class food could be heavy, bland by modern standards, and dominated by overcooked vegetables and rich sauces. Spices were subdued, and refrigeration was limited, so freshness could be a challenge, even for the wealthy. The servants, of course, lived parallel lives. In the same house, while guests dined in candlelight, the scullery maid scrubbed pans below stairs, and the kitchen boy peeled potatoes in the heat of the range. Servants' meals were structured and filling, but rarely luxurious: porridge, stews, suet puddings, leftover roast sliced thin. Still, in a wealthy household, they generally ate better than many of the urban poor. This stark contrast in diets reflected broader divides. The wealthy had both the means and the time to indulge in culinary display. Their meals were not only nourishment, but performance and expression of class, culture, and control. Meanwhile, outside the manor walls, a woman might be boiling bones for broth, a child chewing bread crusts on a doorstep, and a labourer sipping soup by lamplight. And yet, all were eating within the same century, often within the same city. Their lives were vastly different, but their hunger, in its quiet persistence, was shared. As the great machine of the Industrial Revolution turned ever onward, so too did the bodies that fed it coal miners, factory girls, navvies, laying rails through rain and frost. These were the engines of Victorian Britain, and they ran on the most modest of fuels. To work 10, 12, even 14 hours a day demanded calories, yet what the working classes consumed was rarely ample, rarely fresh, and almost never leisurely. Food was functional, chosen not for taste or joy, but for its ability to carry a person through a shift without fainting, to fill the stomach just enough that the day might be finished. Begin, then, in a mining village in the north. The day starts before the sun, with a piece of bread and perhaps a mug of sweetened tea. If luck allows, the bread is spread with dripping, or dipped in milk that's been watered down. In some homes, a small tin of leftover stew from the previous evening is heated before dawn potatoes and onions, maybe a scrap of bacon if it was a good week. At the coalface, the midday meal carried in a tin or wrapped in cloth might be another hunk of bread, perhaps a meat pie made days before, now cold and congealed. A favourite among the miners was the pasty, a thick-crusted turnover filled with potato, onion, and the occasional morsel of meat. Its sturdy casing protected the filling and made it easy to carry, even with blackened hands. The crust, often tough and dry, was sometimes discarded touched too often by coal dust to be appealing. Factory workers ate in brief snatches, often on the floor or beside the machinery. The air smelled of oil and steam, and meals were as likely to be interrupted as they were to be completed. Many relied on the same portable foods: bread, cheese, and the occasional sausage. Tea, sweet and strong, was the elixir of endurance. It was drunk at every opportunity, offering caffeine, warmth, and a rare moment of comfort. Men working outdoors, navvies, road builders, farm hands often had slightly heartier fare. Their employers sometimes offered rations: salt pork, boiled potatoes, hard cheese. These were foods that travelled well and spoiled slowly. The portions were generous by comparison, but the monotony could be numbing. Salted meat, every day. Bread that dried and cracked in the cold. No sauces, no sweetness, just weight, heat, and repetition. Women's diets were no better, and often worse. Many worked as laundresses, seamstresses, or servants, their days consumed by labour as draining as any man's. Yet their meals were lighter sometimes by social expectation, sometimes simply by sacrifice. Mothers often gave their portions to children, sipping only broth or eating crusts after the rest had eaten. In poorer families, meals became an act of quiet self-denial, and yet there was endurance, a pride in managing, in making do. Cookbooks of the time, aimed at the thrifty housewife, were filled with advice on stretching ingredients, repurposing scraps, and creating variety from near nothing. Stews were extended with flour and water. Bones were boiled, dried, and boiled again. Even tea leaves were sometimes reused, dried on a cloth, and steeped a second time. The body paid the cost, of course. Malnutrition was widespread. Rickets and scurvy affected children and adults alike. Tooth decay was rampant. Digestion often poor, but still, people worked. They climbed ladders, turned spindles, hauled coal, and scrubbed floors day after day, year after year. And when pay was delayed, or work dried up, many turned to soup kitchens or charity stalls. Churches and missions sometimes offered a bowl of gruel, or a slice of bread and cheese. These were humble meals, eaten with gratitude. In winter, the lines grew longer. Despite all this, there were moments of celebration. Even the poorest saved for holidays. On Christmas or Easter, a special pudding might be steamed. Raisins, saved over months, were stirred into thick batter, made with lard and black treacle. It was boiled for hours, served hot, and eaten slowly savoured, not just for its sweetness, but for what it represented: effort, patience, and a reminder that hardship could be punctuated by moments of warmth. The food of the labouring Victorian was neither diverse nor luxurious, but it was honest. It bore the imprint of sweat and soot, of long hours and longer weeks, and it served its purpose. Quietly and without thankskeeping, millions of working bodies just nourished enough to carry the weight of an empire. As the cities swelled with factories and fog, the countryside remained quieter, though no less shaped by hardship. Rural life in Victorian Britain moved to the rhythm of the land planting, tending, reaping, resting, and though the distance from urban life was physical, the economic struggles were much the same. Food in the country was shaped not by shops and vendors, but by seasons, soil, and livestock. A family's meals often depended on their own garden, their hens, their pig, and the weather's whims. There was self-reliance here, a frugal dignity that tied survival to the earth. In a modest farm cottage, mornings began early. Before sunrise, the fire was stoked and the kettle hung above the embers. Porridge was a staple: oats boiled slowly in water or milk, sometimes sweetened with molasses or honey if available, more often salted and eaten plain. A slice of bread, perhaps spread with goose fat or jam, followed. The tea was strong, brewed dark to wake the limbs, and often thickened with milk fresh from the cow. Midday brought the main meal, known simply as dinner in many country households. It might be a stew of root vegetable turnips, carrots, parsnips enriched with a marrowbone or bacon rind, cabbage or kale, pulled from the garden, was boiled into softness. On better days, a rabbit or chicken found its way into the pot, especially if one had been snared or gone lame. Everything was used. Bones were saved for broth, and fat was rendered for future cooking. Bread was often homemade, dense and hearty. Families kept sourdough starters or used yeast left from brewing. Baking was done in brick ovens or over open hearths, and loaves were shaped by hand, rising slowly through the morning's warmth. On baking days, the whole house smelled of flour and smoke, and neighbours might trade loaves for eggs, milk or butter. In the evening, the table saw simpler fare: leftovers from dinner, slices of cold pudding, or a bowl of gruel-oats thinned with hot water and stirred until smooth. Sometimes the family shared a pie made from suet crust and leftover meat or vegetables. These pies were sturdy, dense, and deeply filling. Seasonal foods shaped the year. In spring, eggs were plentiful, and nettles or wild garlic were gathered from hedgerows for soups. In summer, berries were collected: blackberries, raspberries, gooseberry seton, fresh or preserved as jam. Autumn brought apples, onions and root vegetables for pickling or storage. Winter was harder. Meals grew heavier: preserved food, salt pork, dried beans, stored potatoes filled the gap until the soil thawed once more. Meat was rare, but when it was available, it was honoured. The slaughtering of a pig, for example, was both an event and a necessity. Nearly every part was used: the meat cured as bacon or ham, the fat rendered into lard, the offal turned into faggots or haggis. Blood pudding, sausages, and jellied trotters were all part of the rural food economy. Milk from cows or goats was not wasted. It was drunk raw, churned into butter, or left to sour into curds. Cheese making, though labour-intensive, provided a way to preserve excess milk. Soft cheeses were eaten quickly. Harder cheeses were stored in cloth and eaten months later. Children learned to forage and fish. They knew which mushrooms to avoid, where wild plums grew thickest, and how to gut a trout with a pocket knife. These skills, passed from one generation to the next, weren't hobbies, they were lifelines. Even so, rural poverty was persistent. Bad harvests, illness, or the loss of a key animal could send a family into deep hardship. For many agricultural labourers, wages were low and inconsistent. Farmhands often ate at the mercy of their employers, taking meals in barns or kitchens after the landowner's table had been cleared. Yet in all this, there remained a quiet abundance not in wealth, but in the rhythms of self-sufficiency. Rural food was slow, shaped by effort and patience. Meals were not grand, but they were grounded, literally and spiritually, in the place they were grown. The countryside had its own economy of taste simple, seasonal, and shaped by the land's moods. In every baked apple, every boiled potato, every jar of jam put up for winter, there was a story of endurance, of survival not through invention or industry, but through timeless cycles of sowing, tending, and harvesting. As the 19th century wore on, growing awareness of poverty and hunger among the working classes gave rise to efforts some sincere, others paternalistic to feed those who could not feed themselves. It was in churches, workhouses, and philanthropic halls that food became a symbol not just of nourishment, but of morality and control. In many Victorian cities, hunger was not hidden. It lived in plain sight in the form of barefoot children, gaunt-faced widows, and the elderly stooped with need. Charity kitchens sprang up to meet this visible need. Churches opened their doors in the colder months, offering bowls of soup, slices of bread, and tea to the destitute. These meals were rarely indulgent, but they were hot, and for many, they were the only food they would receive that day. The most common offering was soup, often called soup for the poor, in records of the time. It was made in great vats, using bones, vegetable peelings, barley, and water. Meat, when present, was a rarity. Bread accompanied the soup, sometimes given by the loaf, more often by the slice. Tea, thin and without sugar, was served from enormous pots and poured quickly into tin cups. But charity came with conditions. In many institutions, recipients were expected to listen to sermons or attend prayer meetings before receiving food. Moral improvement was seen as inseparable from physical sustenance. The poor were not simply fed, they were instructed, corrected, and sometimes judged. Workhouses, established under the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, institutionalized this approach. Those who entered seeking help were offered shelter, clothing, and meals, but at a cost. Families were often separated. Personal freedom was lost, and the food, though regular, was deliberately austere. A typical workhouse diet included bread, gruel, and suet pudding. Gruel, a thin mixture of oats or barley boiled in water, was served at breakfast and supper. Dinner might consist of boiled meat, potatoes, and vegetables, but in small quantities. Cheese was sometimes added, or rice pudding for those deemed infirm. These meals were designed to be plain. The philosophy was deterrence help should be less comfortable than the lowest standard of living outside, so that only the truly desperate would apply. Inmates often ate in silence under the watchful eye of wardens. Portions were measured, cutlery counted, and requests rarely entertained. Still, some reformers pushed back. Figures like Thomas Barnardo and Octavia Hill advocated for more humane conditions, including better meals for children and the elderly. Soup kitchens became more widespread, and in some cities, penny dinners were introduced, meals offered at a minimal cost, ensuring both accessibility and a sense of dignity. Beyond institutions, mutual aid societies and workers' clubs also played a role. These were grassroots efforts organized by communities for their own people. Women's groups ran cooperative kitchens. Unions organized shared pantries for striking workers. In such places, food was more than sustenance, it was solidarity. Religion continued to thread through these efforts. Many Christian groups saw feeding the poor as a form of ministry. The Salvation Army, in particular, became known for its soup kitchens, where nourishment was offered alongside hymn singing and prayer. To them, food was a pathway to salvation, both spiritual and physical. There were also moments of quiet generosity. unrecorded in ledgers or minutes. A baker who gave yesterday's loaves to a widow. A grocer who added an extra potato to a child's sack. A family who, though poor themselves, shared their Sunday pudding with a neighbour. These gestures, humble and unseen, formed an undercurrent of compassion in a society so often structured around discipline and division. Food, in these contexts, was no longer merely a private act, it became a public statement. Who deserved to eat, what they should eat, and under what conditions they should receive it, were all deeply political questions. And while some efforts sought to control the poor through food, others sought to empower them. The legacy of these Victorian system-soft soup kitchens, charitable meals, and institutional rationskern still be seen today. In food banks, shelters, and community kitchens, the echoes of these 19th century efforts remain, and though the philosophies behind them have changed, the underlying truth remains the same, that to feed someone is always to recognize their humanity. As the Victorian era progressed, the story of food began to shift not just in how it was consumed, but in how it was understood. Quietly, amid the clatter of iron and the churn of industry, innovations emerged that would change forever how people stored, transported, and thought about what they ate. In the early part of the century, preservation was still largely traditional. Salting, drying, smoking, and pickling were the methods most relied upon. A household might preserve beans in brine, herring in barrels of salt, or fruit in heavy syrups. These practices were born of necessity, rooted in centuries of repetition. But new technologies were beginning to stir. One of the most significant advancements came in the form of the tin can. First introduced in the early 1800s, it slowly made its way into broader use during the Victorian period, particularly in the second half of the century. Canned meat, fish, soups, and even milk began appearing on shop shelves, initially expensive, but increasingly accessible to the middle classes. Tinned salmon and corned beef became staples for explorers, soldiers, and eventually urban families looking for shelf-stable convenience. These cans were not without issue-sealy versions, were poorly sealed, and could spoil easily, but their promise was undeniable. The idea that food could be safely stored for months, even years, was revolutionary. It changed not just storage practices, but trade and diet. Suddenly, foods once limited to certain regions or seasons could be shared widely, blurring the boundaries of local fare. Another key development was refrigeration, or rather, its humble precursor, the icebox. While mechanical refrigeration wouldn't become common in households until the 20th century, ice was harvested in large blocks and delivered to wealthier homes in insulated boxes. This allowed for better preservation of dairy, meat, and other perishables, and it began to shift meal planning from daily improvisation to longer-term preparation. With these changes came the rise of the grocer's shop, not just a stall or market booth, but a proper storefront. Shelves were lined with labelled goods, dried pasta, tins of soup, bags of rice, and newly milled flours. These stores marked a transition from purely local economies to a more centralized, commodity-driven model. Branding emerged. Packaging became important. Even advertising began to take root. Alongside these material changes was a growing curiosity about what food actually did inside the body. The field of nutritional science was still in its infancy, but people were beginning to ask questions. Why do some foods keep us full longer? Why do certain children seem healthier than others? Why does scurvy strike sailors? These inquiries led to early experiments and the identification of food groups. Scientists like Justus von Liebig promoted the idea that meat extracts could restore strength, leading to the creation of products like beef tea and, later, commercial preparations like Bovril. While the science was sometimes shaky, it represented a shift from food as tradition to food as chemistry. Cookbooks of the time began to reflect this. Recipes were accompanied by notes on digestion, suitability for invalids, and best times for eating certain foods. The notion of a balanced diet was emerging, one that considered variety, proportion, and purpose. Middle-class Victorian women, charged with managing the household, were encouraged to think scientifically about meals. Periodicals offered guidance on planning weekly menus, balancing budgets, and ensuring nutritious variety even with limited ingredients. For those with the means, this was the beginning of modern domestic science. Yet, these advances existed alongside continued struggle. For the poor, much of this was irrelevant as boxes and tinned beef were far beyond reach. But over time, some innovations trickled down. Tinned goods grew cheaper. Grocers opened in working-class districts. Even the concept of planning ahead a luxury in times of daily scarcity began to feel less foreign. At the same time, fears about food safety rose. Urban milk was often watered down, or worse, adulterated with chalk or borax. Bread might be whitened with alum. These concerns led to the first wave of food regulation, culminating in the 1875 Public Health Act and the beginnings of food inspection. It was a small step, but an important one toward ensuring that even the most basic items were safe. By the close of the century, Victorian Britain was standing on the cusp of a food revolution. The meals might still look modest, but behind them were factories, farms, shipping lanes, and scientific papers. The act of eating had become both personal and political, simple and complex. What people ate to survive was still shaped by class, place, and means, but increasingly, it was also shaped by knowledge, technology, and change. And though much remained to be improved, the Victorian era had planted seeds that would grow into the complex, modern food systems of today. And now, as the gaslights flicker low and the clamour of Victorian life fades into a distant hush, we come to the end of our quiet journey through the kitchens, markets, and mess halls of the 19th century. What people ate to survive in the Victorian era was not always grand, nor varied, nor easy. For many, it was a matter of scraping by making use of stale bread, stretching stew with water, counting each potato and each coin. Food was boiled in battered pots, eaten with fingers blackened by coal or cloth, shared across worn wooden tables under ceilings that leaked in the rain. Yet even in hardship, there was rhythm and routine. There was pride in baking a simple loaf, comfort in a hot cup of tea, and rare joy in a holiday pudding steamed for hours. The street sellers, the housewives, the miners and maidservants carved their own place in the story of food, not through opulence, but through perseverance. At the other end of the spectrum, the wealthy dined with pomp and order, their meals choreographed by butlers and footmen. The contrast could not have been starker 7-course dinners, served just blocks from soup kitchens. And yet, all belonged to the same society, turning through the same seasons, reacting to the same changes in technology, science, and trade. In time, things began to change. Canned goods, grocers, nutritional theories, and regulation laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. And while our modern meals may be different in taste and texture, they carry echoes of the passed-off habits formed in hardship, of foods born from necessity, of traditions quietly passed from hand to hand. So now, as you rest, perhaps with the faint hum of your own kitchen nearby, think of the quiet resilience of those who came before, of the miner's pasty, the vendor's hot potato, the mother's penny pudding. These were not lavish, but they were meaningful. They sustained life, warmed hands, brought people together. May your night be warm and untroubled. May your dreams be filled with the soft sounds of hearths and spoons, of market cries and steaming kettles. And may you find comfort in the gentle reminder that through all the clatter of history, the simplest things like a shared meal are often the most enduring. Good night.